Coming up on the Otago Opportunity, we're talking to economist, commentator and author Shamubeel Eaqub. He'll be talking about his views on the state of the New Zealand economy and what he thinks the future might hold. This is the Otago Opportunity, a limited series look at the future of our province. I'm your host, Pauline Moore, and in this series, we're taking the policies of the Opportunity Party and moving them out of the Wellington think tank and into our own backyard here in Dunedin. Each week we'll hear from local business owners, students and families about how a tax reset or a citizens' assembly would actually impact their daily lives. It's not about the politics, it's about the future of the place we call home. Welcome to the Otago Opportunity. Kia ora, and welcome to the Otago Opportunity. Joining me today is Dave Bainbridge-Zafar, the Opportunity candidate for Dunedin, and our guest, Shamubeel Eaqub, Chief Economist at Simplicity, economic commentator and author. Welcome to you both.
Kia ora.
Thank you for taking the time, Shamubeel, to come on the podcast. You're well known and respected for your ability to speak about the economy in a way that people can understand and make sense of. You make economics engaging. How has your own background and early work life influenced your take on economics? You seem to have quite a social lens.
Well, I think economics is always about people. Fundamentally, what is the economy for? And my view is it's to make more New Zealanders better off. When I went to university, my very first lecturer was very focused on, I guess, the well-being aspect of it. And it kind of started that wider conversation and journey around how to think about the economy, perhaps not quite as mathematically or market-driven as some others might have learned.
Out of the recent Social Cohesion New Zealand report, for which you're one of the authors, you've talked about social cohesion being a driver of prosperity. Why is that so important?
It's really important because, just like when I learned economics, it was quite focused on, even then, it was a little bit too focused on, I think, the proximate describers of the economy. And what I mean by that is when you think about the economy, you can kind of talk about it in terms of its component parts, capital, labor, and technology. That's the kind of the old school way of thinking about it. And one of the things that my lecturer at the time, Paul Dalziel, really tried to kind of instill in us is how do you think about it slightly differently? We didn't quite have the tools, but the work of Darren Acemoglu and others who won the Nobel Prize in Economics a couple of years ago, that's what their work was about. What is the fundamental driver of prosperity? And it turns out the fundamental driver of prosperity is not capital, labor, and technology. You can have those things. But what makes that fundamental difference is whether you've got the right culture and institutions that can actually reflect that culture. And what I mean by institutions is the soft things in terms of how we work with each other, but also the rules and regulations that we have. And that's really what social cohesion is, right? When we as a nation are able to meet across difference to a common purpose and hold that over time, that's when we get good, positive outcomes. The reason why I want to do that work on social cohesion is because I feel like that's the bit that's fraying in New Zealand. It's fracturing and it's getting harder for us to, one, agree that we want to have a shared vision of what a more prosperous New Zealand looks like, and two, then come across the difference and unite around a few common things that help us drive forward. We're stuck in neutral. And that's why social cohesion is so powerful. It's not so much that we need a dogmatic or ideological way of going forward. It's how do we work together to bridge those gaps over time.
So why is it fraying, do you think, Shamubeel?
I think a lot of that fraying in social cohesion is because the way that we have set up our society and economy isn't working for everyone. And people are bloody well fed up. So if you think about one of the biggest predictors of that fracturing of views and polarization within the survey, it was very much about inequality and poverty. If you didn't have enough money, if you couldn't see that you could get ahead, if it felt like the society or the economic system or the social system is no longer working for you, then those were the big drivers behind why people felt that New Zealand was no longer working for them. And that's when people retreat. That's when people become oppositional. And I think that's really behind it. But it's not just that. It's also because I think our politics has become much more dogmatic. It's become very tribal. It's become very oppositional. It's all about dividing and conquering. And I think there is also a generational lens. I think older generations had it relatively good because of past generations' investments. They got the benefit of that investment, but I don't think we invested in our physical or social infrastructure now post the reforms of the 1980s. We kind of stepped back from doing that. So there's a bunch of different things. I think all of those things have come together. But one thing that I want to kind of portray, I guess, is just a little bit of optimism. When I look at us compared to what's happening in the rest of the world, yes, we're fractured, but we're not yet polarized. I think we still have time to knit this back together. And when I go to see local communities around New Zealand, I still see elements of social cohesion that's still quite strong. I see an ability to bridge differences in communities that I think should be inspirational for us, that we can do it in a bigger way.
So what you mentioned there, social infrastructure and physical infrastructure. Physical infrastructure is my thing, building water pipes, roads, hospitals, schools, that I understand. What do you mean by social infrastructure?
Social infrastructure, in my mind, is that ability for us to meet in safe third spaces, whether it's in church or in sporting grounds or in community spaces, those places where we come together because we have a shared kind of interest or a shared purpose. And while we're there, we meet across that common interest, but we get to experience all those other differences we might have, whether they're political differences or gender differences or ethnic differences, it doesn't matter. Because you're uniting under a common purpose, it makes it so much easier for us to understand people across their differences. And to my mind, that social infrastructure is really critical, but one that has been hollowing out over time. I mean, as we know, people have become less religious. We're less likely to participate in sport. We just don't have time. And yet, it's that thing that knits society together. You can't just be at work and home all the time. We also need to be of community. We need to be citizens of our community.
You talked, you had a book kind of 10 years ago or so called Generation Rent. And you talked about how, I think the tagline was how greed killed the housing dream. 10 years later, things changed for the better, changed for the worse, not really any different.
Look, I mean, Generation Rent for us was putting our ideas together in terms of not just what was wrong with the housing system, but also how we could fix it. So we had a 10-point plan of the kinds of things that would gradually and over time resolve those issues. And if I take an optimistic lens, I'm trying that for now, I'd say that many of those policies that we talked about are currently undertrained. So what we saw across both the Labour-led government and the national-led government is there is now an acceptance that there is a problem with the housing market in New Zealand, that we need to build more homes, and to do that, we need to have more infrastructure, more planning, more support for the wider construction sector. We need to make renting better. I'm not saying progress is uniform, but I'd be lying if I didn't say I was very pleased to see the amount of progress we have made in a 10-year period. From a policy perspective, I think New Zealand has done a hell of a good job, particularly in places like Auckland, where the unitary plan has been spectacular.
And you wrote that book with your wife. What was the experience of writing that book with your wife like?
Oh, that was wonderful. So Sue and I wrote that together 10 years ago. The book was actually published on the day that our first son was born. She did all the work in terms of the first draft, and then I came over the top and did the final edit. It was great.
Oh, fantastic.
We hear, the average person that at the moment that the economy's improving, farmers are doing better, but the average Kiwi doesn't seem to be getting much relief. Like for them and for us, it's just the cost of living still high. So is it going to get better?
Yeah, look, I think the economy is very big, right? There are so many of us who have different experiences. And right now, you're absolutely right. There are parts of the economy that are doing pretty well. The farming sector's had a really, really good couple of years. They came off a very bad year, 3 years ago when prices were low, growing conditions were really tough, and things were pretty hard in rural New Zealand. And then we saw the big increase in prices, good growing conditions. I was at field days this year, and it was amazing. The experience was positive because people were feeling good about their finances, were feeling good about the weather, the growing conditions. And that's, of course, important for provincial New Zealand because farming is still the mainstay of that economy. But it's not enough on its own to lift all of New Zealand because it's actually not that big a part of the economy anymore. Our urban economy, our services economies are much, much larger. And those have been hit pretty hard. And essentially the way I think about it is the farming sector is much more influenced by what's happening in those big external conditions in terms of prices and demand for their goods and growing conditions. The rest of the economy is dancing to a different tune. It's more about what's going on in terms of your cost of living, what's going on with interest rates. Do people have the reserves to kind of do things, whether it's in terms of hiring people, investing, or investing in themselves? And those things are still pretty tough. So we've had a couple of years when things have been really quite challenging. Beginning of 26, things were starting to look pretty good, just in terms of the beginnings of a recovery. And then that orange buffoon waged war in Iran, and it all kind of broke down, right? And so, you know, those big increases in oil prices, the dislocation in terms of fertilizer, plastics, you name it, that all had an impact. Let's hope that there is a lasting peace in the Middle East, which would be good, both for our economy, but just generally for the world, right? We want humans to be not at war. That would be a really positive thing. So you're right in that there is still not that knitted together recovery where there is broad-based recovery in jobs, incomes, and cost of living is still really high, and people are still really hurting.
Yeah, when I came to New Zealand, I was kind of surprised that a country like New Zealand, you know, a first world country, developed country, whatever you want to call it, still their big exports are wood and essentially sheep and cows. It's a bit like playing Settlers of Catan or something like that. And one of Opportunity's taglines, I guess, really is building the next economy. What does the next economy look like for you if you gaze into the crystal ball of the next kind of 10, 20, 30 years for New Zealand?
Look, I think it's a continuation of the journey. So if you kind of overlay New Zealand on top of Europe, you'll find that we have a massive geography. So there is a reason why we're so bloody good at dairy, meat, and forestry. It's because we've got tons of land and we're really good at growing grass and trees. So it's not surprising that we do those things. The question is, what else do we do? And I think it's an and rather than or. And what I'm seeing around the country when I go around the country or even in the data is New Zealand is diversifying, but I'd like us to diversify more. So what we're seeing, for example, is, yes, we're still very dependent on those major commodities, but there is a very large number of other things that we export, including manufacturers. You just don't see them so much. It's because we've got the big kind of heavy manufacturing that's hollowing out. Think about, you know, our plywood factories in places like Tokoroa. Think about the vegetable processing in Hawke's Bay. Those are closing down, and they're really visible. But what's growing in its stead are quite often businesses that go beneath the kind of the gaze of the public, right? Behind kind of plain sheds, you've got businesses that are doing really cool things, but not big things that you don't often see. So, for example, in Tokoroa, you see two sheds, Satco and Waratah, next to each other on State Highway 1. And they are the biggest producers of forestry harvesting machinery in the Southern Hemisphere. And they export around the world. And you wouldn't know it unless you were in the forestry sector or if you had been in Tokoroa and gone and seen these people. So I think there is an element of that. But if you think about what we really want for the next economy for New Zealand is, how do we unleash that innovation that exists in so many parts of New Zealand and take it from being niche and small to making it big and really successful? I want us to be like big, hairy, audacious when it comes to unlocking this potential, this success that I already see, but it's just too small yet to kind of really register.
So, I mean, Opportunity wants to increase their funding in science and R&D and stuff like that. Is that something you see as being crucial to growing the economy, building the next economy?
Look, I mean, this is kind of the Mariana Mazzucato thing, right? That you need to have an entrepreneurial state, and one of that is doing the basics of research and science really, really well. I'm a big believer that New Zealand's massive success in agriculture and primary sector was built on the back of basic sciences that we did decades and decades ago. So our pasture management, our animal husbandry, we were global leaders in that stuff, both in terms of invention and also in terms of adoption and localization for New Zealand conditions. So that knowledge base is really, really powerful. I was very disappointed with the recent direction of our science policy, which essentially went, we want to have more things that commercialize. Well, do you even know how science works? You can't predict which one's going to be commercialized. Science, the whole point of that endeavor of science is discovery. What we want is research by amazing people with consistency and persistence. That's what creates those opportunities for success in the future. So I think that's one thing. The other thing I think is around how do we get capital into our businesses from going from small businesses to becoming medium and large businesses. So all the evidence that I've seen is in New Zealand, we have kind of what I'd call a U-shaped productivity curve. Very small businesses are super productive, very large businesses are super productive. In the middle is this valley of death. Businesses are unable to transition from being small to being large. And yet that transition is what unlocks and scales that success that we want. So innovation is not just invention, it's about how do we take that invention and turn it into something that is big and it stays and creates jobs and ongoing prosperity.
And what is the answer to that? Why are there those kind of gaps in the middle where companies can't scale and go from small to big? What's stopping them?
Yeah, I think there's two kind of big barriers. One is around leadership and management capability, and the second is around capital markets. So when it comes to leadership and management, I think that's relatively easily solved if we're able to invest in our education for our business community. We still think about education as something that happens at the beginning of your life rather than through your life. So that whole of life learning, I think, is a really powerful concept, including those who have become business leaders. Most business leaders are leaders of accident rather than leaders of design. So if you don't have the right skills, it's very hard to be a good leader or a good manager. And in terms of the second part, which is the capital part, we have a very vanilla banking system and a financing system. It's slowly changing, but there isn't a huge amount of risk capital. There isn't a lot of intelligent capital. So as a result, we don't see that availability of capital. It's very lazy, right? We want to lend money to buy and sell houses. We don't really want to lend money to create good businesses based on relationships and based on risk. So that appetite is simply not there. That's not easy to resolve, but I think we can tweak our banking rules so our risk weights are different. But also, I think we need to allow more innovation into our capital sector, full stop, which I think can happen given what's going on in KiwiSaver now. New Zealand has so much capital now, which is continuing to grow every single day. Even a small amount of that capital moving into that real businesses of New Zealand, I think could really unlock that growth, that scaling up that we're talking about.
Yeah, just on KiwiSaver then, both Opportunity and National want to move up to 6 and 6, so 6% contributions from employer, 6% from employee, and make it mandatory so people can't opt out. What's your view on that? It's a good thing, it's a bad thing? What are the downsides?
Look, when it comes to KiwiSaver, I think we have to make it compulsory and bigger before we're able to make our wider retirement system sustainable, because our super as it stands today is unsustainable. But I do not agree that we should make the employee contributions compulsory, because if you do, it would make lower income people much worse off. They simply cannot afford it. For the average person even, an increase, if they suddenly have to contribute to KiwiSaver, they'd be $50 worse off in their take-home pay. A lot of people can't afford $50 less in their paycheck every week because they're already living paycheck to paycheck. A much better solution would be to make the employer contribution mandatory and increase that gradually over time to 12%. And I think that would be a much better way to do it, because those who already can contribute will continue to contribute, and those who can't would still get the benefit of that employer contribution kicking in and increasing over time. There is no reason why poor people should miss out and should be penalized. I think that equity aspect should be very firmly in the middle of how we think about designing policy.
Would business kind of push back on that proposal, though?
Well, bugger them. I don't care what they're saying. Honestly, this complaining that somehow, isn't it unfair that I have to pay the fair wage for my workers, is unacceptable. But also, the reason I say this is because in reality, most people are in KiwiSaver. It's only a very small proportion of people who are not in KiwiSaver. So the additional cost will be very much at the margin. And we know that if it's well signaled ahead of time, the international evidence is very clear. The cost is borne by the workers, not by the employers. The whole kind of employer contribution is a misnomer anyway.
I want to ask about local government now. So I saw you speak at the local government conference in Christchurch last year. One of the big problems with local government, and this government has suggested rates capping and things like that, is that especially in places like Queenstown, there's not enough ratepayers to pay for the infrastructure that's needed. What's your view on local government and how it can be properly funded? What needs to change?
Yeah, look, local government is a funny thing. It's been through massive waves of reforms over the course of the last 50 years. So I think the last was in the in the late 70s, early 80s, when we had the first wave of amalgamation. And through that period, what happened was there was this removal of funding tools and an increase in their responsibilities. And then we kind of go, isn't it terrible that local government is not doing a great job? But also what we have seen with local government is, I think, the policy poor, where for a long time we saw local government delaying essential maintenance, essential investments to make sure that rates were low. So there was a political economy question and there was a question of regulatory design. Both of those things were problematic. I think regardless of where we find ourselves today and what the reasons were, the way forward has to be a much broader conversation about what is the purpose of local government in New Zealand. We stick to this idea that it's there for local democracy, but it's not doing its job very well because people don't participate in local government elections. People are not really engaged in the breadth of their citizenship in terms of how people engage in local government. As a result, I think what we have seen is this central power and the centralization that says, we're going to defund the local government and we're going to make it easier to push more responsibilities on them. So there is no easy answer here because I think you can always go, but we could have a bed tax or we could have a GST sharing. Those are bits at the margin. That's more about the tools rather than the underlying purpose that we really believe that there is a role for local democracy. I do not think that in central government there is a strong view that we should have local democracy. And therein lies, I think, the problem. I think that's why we've seen this continued pressure on local government over successive decades.
What do you mean by that when you say you don't think that central government kind of believes in local democracy?
Well, it's all lip service, right? I mean, everybody says we believe in localism, but if you look at the actual actions of the policies that they've implemented over the course of the last several decades, it has been an increasing amount of centralization. So you cannot on one hand say that we want localism and on the other hand centralize and go, look at us, aren't we doing a great job? Like, you wouldn't centralize if you believed in localism. And yet we know that the experience of local government is varied across the country and it won't always be the same. So when I was going around doing my doco, what was really fascinating was I met businesses who said, the local government was actually really good. They sorted that out for me when I had a problem. And you don't hear that very often, right? We're not allowed to say nice things about local government. Why not? They're just good people who are trying to be public servants, who are trying to do a good job. Is that such a bad thing? I mean, we're all in it together, right? But what I do sense is there is this kind of this feeling inside of central government that local government is the poor cousin of democracy, that it's actually not that important. Actually, the real business of government is done in Wellington.
As someone that works in local government, I really appreciate you saying I'm a good guy that's just trying to do my job. I just wanted to ask one last question, really, and it's about the tax proposals of the various parties. Labour are saying capital gains tax, Greens are saying wealth tax, and Opportunity are talking land value tax. Can you talk about your view on the pros and cons of those kind of three options?
Yeah, look, I think it's about the wider conversation of how we talk about tax in New Zealand. I think the broad conclusion across New Zealand for a long time had been we are an overtaxed country, which is of course not true, right? If you look at where our taxes are, we're kind of the middle of the OECD, but we have aspirations to have public services like the Nordic countries. And therein lies the big disconnect between those two things. We want lots of lovely things, but we don't want to pay for it. Well, you can't have it, right? So I think the proposals that we're seeing from across the various parties is very much about that change of conversation, that something needs to change, that something different has to happen, that it cannot simply be workers who have to pay more and more tax to pay for all the public services that we have. And I think the main theme that I'm seeing from the opposition parties in particular, because I think the right of center is very unwilling to countenance taxes, is very much that how do we think about capital and the income from capital? Because at the moment, our tax system goes, if you earn income from work, from your labor, that's taxable. But if your money earns money, that's not taxable. Well, they're both income. Why is one income taxable and one is not? And so I think there is a real tension there in terms of where we go next. We know that in terms of our demographics, we will have to do something very different. And because we've got an older population that's very wealthy, we know that there is a very large inequity in terms of effective tax rate paid by rich people versus working people. That's inevitably where the political system will go. My preference is always to tax something that doesn't run away, that cannot move. And that's why land taxes are kind of very elegant from an economist perspective. It's one of those things that you can put in at a very low rate, and it can be very broadly applied on a system that already works, right? We already have a rating system in New Zealand. There's already an agreed method of valuation, all those other bits and pieces. It becomes much simpler than other forms of tax we might have. But I think the big issue for us when we talk about taxes, it's not just whether we can implement a new tax, it's whether that tax would last through multiple changes of government. It has to endure. We cannot have a tax system that happens for 3 years and then is undone, because that would be the worst possible thing to create that lack of trust amongst New Zealanders that we've got a system that we can rely on to move towards something that's more sustainable.
That's great. Well, I think we're already at the limits of our time. Is that right, Dave? Can we squeeze any more time? Or is that's it? Thank you, Shamubeel. We really appreciate you coming and spending your time. Really interesting conversation. Like I say, we could go on a lot longer.
Yeah, look, I mean, my answers weren't that short because I've had a long day, but hopefully you got some good stuff out of that.
We absolutely did. Thanks, Dave. We'll chat again soon. That's all from the Otago Opportunity today. Follow us and join us next time.
By H.Cargo, Secretary at opportunity.org.nz.